Hello, I'm Hazem Seeker. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. As leaders from the world's richest countries meet in Latin America, we'll ask if the G20 could be facing an identity crisis. Also this week, petrol, food and medicine shortages. What's changed for Zimbabweans since the fall of Robert Mugabe? Plus, motoring blues, why General Motors' restructuring plans are making US President Donald Trump unhappy. Who runs the world? Well, when it comes to the economy, it could be argued the G20 does. These are the group of countries that generate 80% of world output. They also burned more fossil fuels than the rest of the world. They are, in fact, the dirty rich. And if you want to change the world, surely it starts here. The group was formed in 1999, but took on greater importance in the wake of the global financial crisis of 2008. Its purpose? To develop global policies to address today's most pressing challenges. These days, the G20 finds it hard to agree on almost anything, let alone trade disputes, migration and climate change. Now, this week's summit was in Argentina, the first time a South American country got to host the meeting. Teresa Bo has more.
The mothers of Plaza de Mayo have been demanding to know the whereabouts of their missing children since they disappeared during Argentina's dictatorship 40 years ago. The G20 gives them a chance to take their message to a wider audience.
The city is under siege. It seems like we're under a curfew, but we made it here, and once again we call on world leaders to stop the policies that create hunger, poverty, and that hurt the working class.
They weren't alone. Thousands of people are promising to take over the streets of Buenos Aires.
In spite of these protests, this is a historic event for Argentina and an opportunity to be at the center of world affairs, even though there are several issues overshadowing the main objective, which is to build consensus on crucial issues like climate change and inequality.
Among them, the presence of Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and a request by Human Rights Watch to investigate him over the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Khashoggi's killing has strained relations between Saudi and the Western world. Emmanuel Macron says he's ready to talk to the Crown Prince about what happened.
I have always been very clear on the case of Saudi Arabia, and I will inevitably have the opportunity to discuss it with the Saudi Crown Prince on the margins of this G20 meeting.
Donald Trump arrived in Buenos Aires ready to discuss the trade war between the United States and China. He's cancelled his meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin after the seizure of Ukrainian ships by Russia at the Crimean Peninsula. This protester came all the way from the United States, carrying a baby Trump balloon. He's been an activist opposing the U.S. foreign policy since the Vietnam War.
We would like the President of the United States to act a little bit more mature. That's if I was going to boil it down to just one statement, it would be that. We think it's asinine that he's on Twitter. We think it's asinine that he's petulant, that he picks fights, seems to want to take the smallest and lowest road instead of the highest.
This mass yoga session was organized to help leaders concentrate on resolving their differences. The protest around Buenos Aires will remind them how hard that task is likely to be.
Now, the G20 is made up of 19 countries. The European Union is also a member. Collectively, G20 members account for 85% of global economic output, 2/3 of the world's population, and 75% of international trade. Well, joining me now from Sydney is Tim Harcourt, economist and author. Thanks very much for being with us. So let me ask you, first of all, how much importance do you attach to the G20 as an organization? Is it still an important forum for exchanging views, or has it kind of lost its way since 2008?
Well, I think it was a very important organisation in 2008 during the global financial crisis, and the finance ministers G20 was an invention of Australia and South Korea. It's one of the few forums where you get the major powers together in a summit like this. So I think it's still got its relevance, particularly at a time when we need good international economic institutions.
Another big issue, of course, and a very contentious one at the moment, is the whole issue of climate change and what to do about it. Two big reports that were out in the last few days on the cost of this to economies in the US and in Europe. Is there any consensus among countries about what to do?
Well, a country like Australia is heavily dependent on fossil fuels for our export revenue, so in some ways the burdens aren't being shared quite properly. And in some cases, they're expecting developing countries to share some of the burden right at a time when industrialisation is actually pulling a lot of people out of poverty. So they're probably less willing to give up some of that momentum they've been able to get in countries like China, India and Indonesia. So I expect there won't be much consensus on climate change in terms of causes, but also in terms of what solutions you use, whether it be market mechanisms or not.
If I'm not mistaken, this is the first time that a South American nation is hosting the G20 Summit. What does this summit mean for Argentina, which is, of course, dealing with its own very serious economic problems right now?
Yeah, it's been a matter of don't buy from me, Argentina, because in some ways, in terms of resource endowment, in terms of agriculture, mining and immigration, Argentina should be like Australia, but its institutions of late have let it down. I think in many cases there's countries in South America that are doing quite well, like Peru and Chile, Colombia, members of the Pacific Alliance, whilst Argentina has probably been one trouble spot in South America. Even though the IMF did praise Argentina when there was a bailout this year, I think the main thing is to restore trust into the institutions, because Argentina does have very good endowments of mining and agriculture and a very strong base of human capital. Argentines do very well around the world, so if they can tap into that great reserves of human capital, then they can have some chance of medium-term recovery. But certainly they'll try and use the prestige of the G20 to focus on some of the better aspects of the Argentine economy.
And there are, of course, a lot of changes happening in the digital world right now on the internet. And this year in particular has been a big one for the whole issue of data privacy. How do you think the G20 nations as a whole are tackling that?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because in some ways the G20 nations that are geared by the great information age and the great information-rich capitalist institutions in the US and Japan, they're using data mining for consumer-driven behaviour, whilst countries that have a bigger tradition of social control, like China, are using data mining for social control with its own citizens in terms of their own social credits. So I think they're both tackling with the same issues of how to gather data, but they're putting them to quite different purposes. I think in the cases of the more capitalist side of the G20, they're using it to basically drive consumer behaviour and better target demand, whilst in other cases they're using it more for internal social control, which is actually quite a worrying trend and probably not what some of these great leaps in technology was meant to perform.
Tim Harcourt in Sydney, good to speak with you.
Thanks very much for your time. Thanks for having me on.
All right, still to come on Counting the Cost. If it were a country, the ocean would be the 7th largest economy on the planet. We'll be looking at the $1 trillion blue economy. But first, Microsoft overtook its tech rival Apple as the world's most valuable publicly listed company this week. It's been 16 years since the software giant has held the top spot. Microsoft shares jumped 3% on Wednesday, pushing its market value to $850 billion. It's become a major player in the cloud computing services world. Britain's economy will be worse off outside the European Union no matter how it leaves. That is the upshot of a report from the Bank of England looking at post-Brexit scenarios. In the worst case, where Britain crashes out of the bloc with no deal, the central bank says the economy would shrink by as much as 8% in a year. While under the agreement being pushed by Prime Minister Theresa May, the economy will be about 4% smaller over 15 years. Women may face a much wider wage gap than commonly cited data indicate. That's according to a new study by the Washington-based Institute for Women's Policy Research. Economists there analysed the incomes of men and women who worked for at least 1 year between 2001 and 2015. The new study found women earned just 49 cents to the typical men's dollar, far less than the 80 cents usually reported. Now, thousands of jobs will go in the largest restructuring by U.S. car maker General Motors since the 2008 financial crash. The planned closure of 5 big car manufacturing plants in North America is a blow to U.S. President Donald Trump, who's promised to turn around the industry. Shihab Ratansi reports.
Estimates for the number of jobs lost as General Motors restructures are as high as 14,700, some 8,000 white-collar, the remainder factory workers. The plants affected are in Michigan, Ohio and Maryland in the US and Ontario in Canada. Production will also cease at 2 as-yet unnamed plants outside North America by the end of 2019. In Lordstown, Ohio, workers despaired not just for those being laid off, but for the whole community.
For every one of our jobs, I've heard around 7 jobs on the outside are obviously impacted. So, not only the folks that are working in the part supplying sector, but look at the grocery stores, right? Look at the restaurants, the doctor's offices, the hospitals.
GM says the layoffs are necessary to adapt to a changing US car market. Sales of sedans are down as sales of SUVs and trucks grow. The company also says it will focus more on autonomous and electric vehicles. It's been 10 years since General Motors was bailed out with taxpayer money, a fact not lost on the United Auto Workers Union, which has vowed that the decision will not go unchallenged. GM's production decisions, in light of employee concessions during the economic downturn and a taxpayer bailout from bankruptcy, it said, put profits before the working families of this country, whose personal sacrifices stood with GM during those dark days. These decisions are a slap in the face to the memory and recall of that historical American-made bailout. We must step away from the anti-worker thinking of seeking simply the lowest labor cost on the planet. GM exceeded expectations with better-than-expected third-quarter earnings of $2.5 billion, boosting shareholder value. And Monday's announcement led to a further rise in its share price. GM says it will save $6 billion in cash as a result of the restructuring. This is a blow to Donald Trump, who said his corporate tax cuts would help save the U.S.'s manufacturing industry. The president has repeatedly boasted about his role in GM's future job creation. And on Monday, he said he remains hopeful.
I'm not happy about it. Their car is not selling well, so they'll put something else. I have no doubt that in a not-too-distant future, they'll put something else. They better put something else in.
As a result of Trump's economic policies, the trade deficit is going to nearly double over the next 5 years. It's going to cost millions of manufacturing jobs.
2 of the plants affected are in swing states that were key to Trump's victory in 2016. The president's pitch to the American workers who voted for him is fraying.
To Zimbabwe now. The country is trying to reboot its economy 1 year on from the army coup that overthrew Robert Mugabe. President Emmerson Mnangagwa was elected last July, but his government is failing to attract much-needed foreign investment. And thousands of Zimbabweans have been out protesting. Haru Mutasa has more from the capital, Harare.
The last time opposition supporters protested was back in August, when 6 people were shot and killed by soldiers. They are back on the street after the police assured them they will be safe if their march was peaceful. They want Zimbabwe's government to fix the struggling economy, create jobs and bring down food prices. They also say President Emmerson Mnangagwa should resign, insisting he stole elections in July.
We are not agreed on the president. There's a crisis of legitimacy. Mr. Mnangagwa, yes, was confirmed by the Constitutional Court, but we still have to resolve from a legitimate point of view the contestation around who was voted by the people so that the vote counts.
Mnangagwa says it'll take a long time for the economy to recover and that Zimbabweans need to be patient. Some government officials say the main opposition leader, Nelson Chamisa, is just trying to get attention. They say he wants some kind of role in government, maybe even Prime Minister. Nelson Chamisa says that is not true. Some fuel pumps are dry. Motorists queue because of shortages. It's the second fuel crisis in just over a month. There's also a shortage of foreign currency, especially the US dollar. The main opposition leader insists Mnangagwa's administration has failed. He says there'll be more protests if the situation doesn't improve.
Well, joining me now from London is Charles Robertson, Global Chief Economist at Renaissance Capital. Good to speak with you again, Charles. So 1 year on, how would you assess things? Are Zimbabweans better or worse off after Robert Mugabe?
Sadly, they're still worse off. There's still huge challenges, particularly on the currency side, on the banking side, and there's still a lack of foreign investment going into the economy. So it hasn't got better yet.
Let's talk about the lack of foreign investment. Why is that, do you think?
Part of the problem is that the elections didn't win an international seal of approval. So the EU condemned them. The problem with that is that it makes a deal with the IMF and the World Bank and the African Development Bank to clear big arrears that Zimbabwe has and to reduce their foreign debt. That sort of deal becomes much harder without international support. And if you don't have a clear foreign debt story situation, then it's harder for companies to say this is the right economy for us to invest in.
The government are saying that all of this takes time and they're counselling patience. Was it realistic to expect things to change much in a year after decades of corruption and mismanagement? It was
the best case scenario. The difficulty is there's a lot of power politics still at play in Zimbabwe. The top priority of the finance minister seems to be reform. He wants to address a ridiculously large budget deficit. Some of the policies he's attempted to push through since early October look like an attempt to try and bring realism to the currency rate as well. But it takes strong political will to push through tough reforms, and that has not been conveyed across to the population, that this is the united view of everybody in government that they should be going down this one course.
You mentioned earlier inflation in Zimbabwe. What's the big challenge there? What's going on there?
They've got this problem where the currencies the foreign currency, the dollars that you have had in your bank account in Zimbabwe for years, since the last bout of hyperinflation in 2008, people have just been putting dollars into the bank accounts. They can't now take those dollars out of the bank accounts. And the changes since early October seem to suggest they never would be able to. The government, meanwhile, has printed a lot of these bond notes to finance itself through the election. It gave big pay increases into your bank account if you work for the government, but not in actual cash dollars because there weren't any. And all of this has contributed to inflation and severe shortages. I took my 12-year-old daughter to Zimbabwe a few weeks ago it turned into a lesson in frontier economics. You saw fuel queues that were taking an hour for people to get fuel, empty shops with all the shelves in a shoe shop gone, and wildly varying black market rates, parallel market rates for the currency as well. I mean, it really was. It's become very messy in the last couple of months.
If things are put right, does Zimbabwe have the potential to do well economically? Does it have the natural resources and the agriculture there to flourish?
Absolutely. All the work that we've done looking at development from countries in South Asia, Africa, and Latin America tells us you need three things, three underlying things to really take off, to industrialize, to become a middle-income country. And those three things are education. And Zimbabwe's got and has had a great education system for many decades. Secondly, you've got to have electricity. And Zimbabwe's got plenty. And then thirdly, you need high investment. And that's where Zimbabwe's been lacking. So even beyond the fact that they've got great mining resources and good agriculture resources, which they do, which can make you a well-off country to the tune of, say, $1,000, $2,000 per capita GDP. What's fascinating about Zimbabwe is it has all the other resources, the electricity and education it needs to be a $5,000, $10,000 per capita GDP country. It just needs good policy. And it's quite shocking to see that it's had these very good inheritances for such a long time now. In the 1980s, Zimbabwe was an industrial nation. Manufacturing was more than 20% of GDP. It just got blown by bad policies.
Could this escalate, though? I mean, things are going to get worse before they get better?
The risk for Zimbabwe today is still things like agriculture going wrong. There's talk of an El Nino event, one of these periodic times when the harvests get very bad. And we had one a few years ago, and that really does hurt a country like Zimbabwe. You've also got the issue now that if savings are repriced from what was you put in $1, you could take out $1, to you did put in $1, but now you can only take out 0.3 of a dollar, and they're going to be called Zim bond notes. If that's happened, then basically Zimbabweans will have lost their savings twice in a decade. Hyperinflation in 2007-8, and now to have them redenominated into a much weaker currency a second time in a decade. I think that it's going to take such a long time for Zimbabwe to restore confidence. Why would anyone put money into a bank account now in Zimbabwe any time in the next 5 to 10 years? I think it's going to be a real challenge to get people to have faith in the banks. But if they don't put money into the banks, there's going to be no money for lending and no money for investment beyond what foreigners might bring in. So this is, I think, some really significant challenges now for the government.
Charles Robertson, thanks for being with us.
Pleasure.
And finally, some years ago, economists put a monetary value on the resources off our coastlines. They estimated the ocean or blue economy to be worth $24 trillion. Catherine Sawyer reports from a conference which made a splash this week in Nairobi.
On the sidelines of the world's first Blue Economy Conference, delegates are treated to a show of clothes and bags crafted from fish skin, all the way from the shores of Lake Turkana in northern Kenya to the Atlantic Ocean and other seaside regions. Designers here say the future of fashion can include fish skin.
A tilapia clutch looks like nothing else you see in the market.
But this conference is more than just about fish and fashion. Delegates are discussing how to harness a sustainable water economy that is valued at up to $6 trillion and to protect assets worth an estimated $25 trillion.
Of the 22 megacities, of more than 10 million, 15 is a coastal cities. And the trade, 95% of the trade is from the coastal area. So I think this is the importance of the coastal cities, the blue economy, and we have to look at in the whole ecosystem.
Poor maritime transport systems, uncoordinated anti-piracy operations, harmful fishing practices and poaching, plastic pollution, as well as destruction of coastal ecosystems make it difficult to fully harness the potential of the economy.
People from around the world, from Europe and Asia, even as far away as Latin America, are coming to African waters to fish. And they're doing so without using those resources in a manner that makes sure that they're sustainable, and that none of that wealth is coming to Africa.
Everybody here has talked about how important this conference is. Those addressing the gathering, including heads of state, have said all the right things about doing more to protect water resources, empowering local communities and authorities, and growing the economy. But there's also concern that this may be another talk shop with many good ideas, but little action.
Organizers of the event say the real work of staying true to commitments made here begins now.
We wanted to focus on leaders coming here and making commitments about what they will do in their countries, not for the world, but in their countries. And it is the aggregate of what they're saying that we shall use to conceptualize what the world will be doing for the blue economy.
At the end of the three-day conference, heads of government and agencies committed to put in place policies to build a sustainable blue economy. They've also promised to help poor countries build capacity to more effectively patrol seas and oceans, as well as strengthen political leadership and international cooperation.
All right, that is our show for this week. Remember, you can get in touch with us by tweeting me at Hazem Seeker and use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. There's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Hazem Seeker from the whole team here. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.